Hello. Gotta make sure my hair's up. Always. All right, my hair's a little crazy, but what are you gonna do? Give me a minute here while I try to hand out the technical things here. Basically, what I'm trying to do right now is share this to Tripping on Legends. There we go. All right. So I've got a different kind of setup here so I can, what's going on, Dave? So I can temporarily, hey Colleen, good to hear from you again. So I can temporarily, when the time comes, switch over to here to type something up. So you might see me in profiles. I'm trying to respond to some of the things that you put on with specific things. But welcome to, ooh, wait a minute. See if I can do this right here. I'm going to try to share this right now. It's going to let me share to a page. Share to a page. I am sharing it to Tripping on Legends right now, Natalie, so you don't need to do that. It is already, boom, up and running. There you go. All right, so good evening. I'm Christopher Balzano. Natalie is watching, so I can say, and I also have Natalie Christ in the house. And welcome to Tripping on Legends Live. And today's topic is lore versus lies. So what's going to happen is I'm going to kind of go off on some things, and I'm going to kind of share some things with you and kind of have a discussion on it. And as I'm doing so, if you want to share like a story where your idea about the paranormal has been challenged by finding out that something that you thought was the truth is a lie, I want you to feel free to share it as I talk, and then I can kind of go back and hit on some of those as we go. So I probably won't interrupt my initial narrative, just so that I can get some of this stuff out, but I would also love to hear your examples of it, and also what it meant to you. So both responses to what I'm saying, and then examples that you might have known and kind of how it played itself out. I think we tried to cover this topic on the night that my dryer exploded, and I was having these horrible electrical problems. And so I've remedied some of that. I'm not sure quite what that even means, remedying some of it. I'm hoping that it doesn't go off again. At least I know that I've got a secure Wi-Fi because I'm on my phone. So even if the Wi-Fi does go out, which it has happened to do when I'm doing these live shows for some weird reason, I'll still have that. I want to start with a discussion of the Bloody Bucket Bridge. For those of you guys who haven't read or listen to the episode about the Bloody Bucket Bridge. It's basically a haunting here in Florida, Wauchula, Florida, that has this great folklore attached to it, this great backstory of it. And it is essentially, there's this place in the Wauchula River that goes over this bridge, which is nicknamed Bloody Bucket Bridge. And it's on Bloody Bucket Road. And I am looking down right now, because I always get, okay, midwife. The word is midwife that I'm looking for. But the backstory of it is that there was a midwife who, and I'm not going to give you all the details. You can go back and listen to those episodes. Or even maybe I'll post the thing to it, the link to the story of it. But essentially there is a midwife who is responsible for killing all these children for various reasons are given. And she buries the bodies in this area known as Bloody Bucket, or the Bloody Bucket Bridge, near the Bloody Bucket Bridge. And she dumps the fluid from the birth into the river as well, the afterbirth. And she's eventually caught, she's fired, she goes crazy. And she, for years, I'm looking at myself in the other picture right there. For years, she goes on this kind of crazy kind of breakdown where she is constantly seeing the buckets being filled with blood and trying to dump them back into the water, and her husband's telling her she's going crazy, and the story is that if you go there on a moonlit night, full moon, by the light of the full moon, you will see that the water has turned blood red from all of the murders and the deaths, and she eventually drowns in the water herself. And along with this, there are hauntings that are supposed to happen there as well. So as if the bloody river itself is not enough, you also have these stories of hearing baby cry, hearing something splash in the water as if someone has like fallen in. All those crazy shadows and lights that Natalie knows I love so much because they're non-specific, right? We did some research doing this. You can go back and watch the videos and everything. We did this January 31st or 30th. I can't remember how many days January has. We found that the story is completely false, right? It is called Bloody Bucket Bridge. It is called Bloody Bucket Road. But it's mainly because there was a bar at the end of it where there used to be so many fights, and it was so violent that every night, at the end of the night, the people would brush and mop all the floors, and then dump the buckets full of blood and teeth out the door. And so the bar became known as Bloody Bucket Bar, Bloody Bucket Road, Bloody Bucket Bridge. No backstory attached to it whatsoever. So where did it come from? Well, in doing our research, we found an article from 2005, which basically said, there's this place, it's called Bloody Bucket Road. I am going to tell you a fictionalized story of why I think it's called that way, because my people are saying, we love your fiction, write some fiction. So here's my story. She goes on this elaborate story that I just told you, which is told to her from an old man standing outside the Circle K. Clearly, she is stating that this story is fake. Is she responsible for lying to us? Right? So from her words, this story gets sparked, and it's now a place where people go, although it's not as popular as the internet would make it seem to be. People go, they tried to get the blood, they tried to analyze the data and get voices on tape and all these kinds of things for a legend that's not true. And yet, she clearly says that it's not true, right? She says, I am making up a story to explain something to you. Should we accuse her of lying? She has written a story which has become folklore. But she's not a liar. She clearly says she's not telling the truth. The people, I believe, the people who afterwards spread that story, as if it were true, are not liars, right? That's how folklore gets spread. You can't get away with this thing in real life, right? If you hear a rumor from someone and you spread it, you're spreading a rumor, you're as much of a liar as the next person. But she said it was fake, right? She said it wasn't true. Other people picked it up, misconstrued what she said, spread it, and it's kind of become a thing. Not a liar. My opinion, not a liar. And yet, now here's where we get to it. Does that responsibility change? Okay? I tell you, where you and I are talking, I tell you this story. I read a book. I have heard that story. I have heard that story by multiple people. I share that story with you. Am I a liar? Right? What is the responsibility of the writer in spreading that story, right? What is the responsibility of the folklorist in spreading that story? And that's kind of an interesting thing for us, because we are at like that. I refer to this in the details. That thin line between being liars or storytellers or fiction writers, even you could say, and folklorists, people who are spreading these ideas, right? We're on that thin line. We try our best at Tripping on Legends to say, here's what we can back up, here's what we can't back up, but we're still pretty much accountable for spreading something, for making it come out. That's a debatable thing, right? What is my responsibility? I'm working on 2 books right now. What is my responsibility as I'm uncovering this? To say that they're potentially fake, to say that they're potentially just folklore, or to give you the story and let you decide for yourself. Is that fair to you? Is that I'm giving you kind of like, fake news, but not giving you necessarily the ability to follow up on it, right? Most people, when they read a book, most people, when they hit a website, especially if it's about ghosts, unless there's an interest in it, that's really high. So there's a lot of people posting different things. They take kind of paranormal at its word, right? Which is weird, because as investigators, difference between an investigator and a legend tripper, or even just a consumer. As investigators, they wouldn't settle for that, right? And even if they believed the story, the backstory, they would still go and investigate the place and kind of hit it up and try to get as much information as they possibly can from it. Does that responsibility exist for the writer, for the folklorist, for the storyteller? To some degree it does, right? So that's kind of ambiguous. That's a weird line, but I want to share something with you. And unfortunately tonight, I'm going to talk about 3 people. Annette Jones says it's up to the investigator to do their due diligence and verify the information. Now, that's interesting, though, because before I get onto this, I'll touch upon what Annette has said. It is up to the investigator to do their due diligence. Say the investigator goes to that site. Okay, so right now we're talking about a haunting that's not necessarily like in a person's home, okay? They could go there 5 times and get no evidence, but does that prove that the backstory is not true? Does it prove that the location isn't haunted? Just because you don't get anything, does that mean that you've proven that there's nothing there? Okay, so that's an interesting topic, and that's something that investigators talk about all the time. It's something I've hit on in my books too. People who go into a house once or maybe even twice and certify it as not haunted, that's kind of, assuming that you're going to catch lightning in a bottle every single time. And actually, it's kind of the spark of doing what I do, because so many times people's personal experience would be cast aside and they'd say, we didn't find anything, so here are 27 things that are natural but almost as improbable that we'll post as possible alternatives to ghosts. But I want to share this book with you. And Charlie Carlson, Weird, Florida. Now, he's no longer with us, so I feel a little bit awkward talking about, and actually the 3 people I'm going to talk about tonight specifically have all passed. He talks about Bloody Bucket Bridge here, and I think that the proliferation of the story comes because it's in this book. And he gives an account that I just gave you, but much more detail. Then he goes on to list, see if you can see it here, 4 specific accounts, or 4 personal accounts from readers. And you can kind of tell from the names of these readers that they responded to a post, because they sound more like screen names than actually like names. And 3 of them are kind of just specific. Oh, I heard there's a place here. It's called the Bloody Bucket Bridge, blah, blah, blah. But this is from Buddy X. On Halloween night in 2003, we parked our canoe near the canoe launching place and walked down to the road called Bloody Bucket just to see if we could see anything. It's a really scary place, and I don't advise anyone with a faint heart to go down there at night. There are sounds that come out of the woods by the river that sound like children crying. There is a story that a woman killed her baby, but the rest of us did not think so. So it sounded, they say it sounded like crying. As we were standing there, something ran out of the woods and crossed the road. We ran back to our car, So, not too much happened, and Buddy X is not saying we saw the ghost of the Bloody Bucket Bridge or anything like that. However, the story itself the story is set in October of 2003. October of 2003 is when the woman wrote the article basically giving the background for the Burley Bucket Bridge. Halloween, actually. This gentleman says he went down there in 2003 because it was already a well-known story by then. But the story wasn't published until October of 2003. Now, there's two possible explanations for this. Keep in mind, this book is published in 2005. I believe it's 2005. Pretty sure it's 2005. Either Buddy X is lying, or Charlie Carlson is lying, right? Someone is not telling the truth there. And I understand, looking up the date real quick, I know we've done this before and I've looked this up like 100 times, but I'm pretty sure it's 2005. Someone's not telling the truth, someone's lying, right? I understand the pressure to have personal experiences in a book. I understand the pressure to believe someone that tells you something. I have to be honest, I feel like those personal quotes that are in there are not true. They're made up. It's really hard to throw that up against another writer, but I just honestly feel that way. And which leads me to my next kind of story. I do have it here because we talked about it last time. But New England Ghost Files. If you've never read New England Ghost Files, you should. It's a great book, even if you don't live in New England. It's got great stories. I actually use it to teach. Charles Turk Robinson is well-renowned. If he had never written New England Ghost Files, he might not be as well-known to us, the average person, but he was an anthropologist who was trained at Harvard. I mean, he wrote for the Rehoboth newspaper for years. For those of you guys who don't follow me all that well, my first investigations were all following up on stories from Charles Turk Robinson's book. It's a huge, influential piece of nonfiction for anyone who is into ghosts in New England. It seems like everyone eventually comes across it one way or the other. Years ago, more than 10 years ago now, I was working with someone who is well respected, and I'm going to put that out there. Is well respected. And he told me, flat out, Charles Robinson made up these stories. Charles Robinson made these stories up, and that idea, over time, has gained a lot of momentum, right? A lot of people have found issues with the things that he wrote his book. Now, it's interesting to note, I'm seeing a lot of people, Dave and Colleen, saying that they love this book. It's interesting because this is a book from 1994. So it's well before, it's 10 years before Ghost Hunters, right? It's well before the modern paranormal craze, and some can even say it sparked the modern paranormal craze. There was no template for how to write a ghost book, right? So people question the way that he did things. And when I first began, and I think I still do to some degree, and I read this in an article when I was doing research on him. And he said, I never give the names of people in my book because many don't want their stories known. They want the story known, but they don't want to be attached to it. He said, but more importantly, when you eliminate the fame that comes with, and the recognition that comes with having your name in print, people are more likely to tell you the truth. And when you take out the fact that you won't be using their name, people are going to be more honest with you. So he never gave the full name or the real name of anyone in his stories, which also means you can't follow up with it, right? There's no way to really necessarily question the people that he talked to. There have been other experiences over the years, and so it's come to light that that book may be fake, right? Now, the interesting thing is you can talk about some of the big ones. Red-headed hitchhiker. Some people claim they've known about it for years. Some people say no one ever heard about it, and no one ever kind of like was solid about it until that book. Then all of a sudden everyone knows the red-headed hitchhiker, and everyone has a story about it. That those initial stories that he wrote down that are like canon, man. Like if you're in New England, like, and you're a Bridgewater Triangle person especially, those red-headed hitchhiker stories, you can recite them like that, right? Some people say he made them up. Now, as an editor, as a teacher, as a person whose job it is to identify and call out people who are cheating and accused of plagiarism, you kind of learn voice. You kind of learn how certain people talk, how certain people write. That way, when you read something that isn't someone's, you can say, this is not how you sound when you write. I know you're writing. I know your voice. There's an argument for those kinds of people that if you read that book, it all sounds like the same person, right? The interviewees, the people who are sharing their experiences, all sound like Charles Robinson, or at least all sound the same. You can say they sound different from Charles Robinson because he has a very black and white approach. Like Dave said, he just gave the stories the way they were. And that was the way that I modeled myself when I was doing Mass Paranormal Crossroads. Give just the information of the story. How many people were there, present it. Now, Charles Robinson, for those of you guys who don't know, passed last fall. Before he did, I had a very long conversation with him, hours, over the phone, because I was here. One of the things that we discussed was reissuing the book. He wanted to rewrite the book. He wanted to add chapters to it, add stories to it. He wanted to include what's been going on with some of these stories since then. He wanted to add stories that added on to it. Things like an Anawan Rock. So I'm talking to him. And he's sick. He was sick at the time. He suffered from cancer for years. So at the time, I had to stop. And here's a man I respect because he kind of got me started doing what I do. I had to stop. I said, Charles, did you make these stories up? I can't go forward with this book if I know that these stories are not true. If I know that there was no pharmacist in Fall River, that I know that the haunting in Whitman Farm, which is probably my favorite story in there, not true. I need to know whether these are true or not. And we talked for hours after that point. He wasn't offended. He knew who had started the stories. Very clearly, he got into it. I should probably say, because I want to legitimize the accusation. The person who I was speaking with was also going to be working for the same publisher. And he said, well, I don't have anything about this or this. And the publisher essentially said, that's okay. Like, we don't care if you make this stuff up. Like, Charles Robinson does it all the time. I believe, now I'm torn, right? I'm torn because one person I highly respect, I had a conversation with Charles Robinson and he flat out denied it. Right? Now, here's the thing. There have been tons and tons of stories, tons and tons of hauntings, of evidence that have been sparked from that book, right? So if that book isn't real, right? If that book never happened, if those stories are fake, where are we getting this evidence from? Is it okay to lie in the paranormal? If you were doing it under the pretense of adding to the lore of a place. If you've listened to episode 43, we posted it earlier this week. We posted it, I think, yesterday, or the day before. Wednesday. And we talked about whether or not the stories that were coming out of Silver Springs are fake. They seem to be published, they seem to be written by a fiction writer who was picked up by one publication, picked up by another publication, picked up by another publication, until the story becomes kind of connected to it. Now, if you listen to that episode, or if you're just listening to me now, that place is crazy, crazy haunted. It's crazy haunted. But these backstories are fake, as far as we can tell. Some of them, I'm going to give you some of the highlights of the fakeness of them. One talks about them jumping off a cliff, like a bluff. There's no cliffs or bluffs near there anywhere. One of the stories talks about a Native American tribe hunting them down and keeping the family separated and being enemies with each other, and yet the tribes are literally hundreds of miles away from each other, right? And so when she wrote it, she never even checked to see whether the tribe that was in that area, which is weird because she lived in that area. Is that a lie? Is that a lie? And should we accept that a lie? Should we go back and then say to those people, no, you're giving us the wrong thing? Now, if you're an investigator, flat out, and I'm not even talking about you're a TV show and you fake evidence. I think we can all agree that that's absolutely horrible. There's nothing about that that's honest and right and should be hailed. I'm just going to read Dave's comment really quick before we move on. Yeah, you have to admit, if Charles Turk Robinson made it all up, he was plenty obscure with his selections of locations. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Dave. What do you mean by he was plenty obscure with his selection of locations? I'll go back and then if you can respond to that, Dave, I'll get back to your question. Should she be accused of lying? Should these people who are doing that, evidence people, TV people, if you fake something, what was that? You see something and you're reacting. If you're overly exaggerating, maybe that's a tricky place. But if you're flat out making up evidence, if you're flat out saying something happened, if you're flat out making up EVPs, now, that's a difference, right? If you are listening to an EVP and you manipulate it to the point that it makes sense to other people, and then you present it, right? Usually in that situation, people say, oh, I've manipulated or whatever. You can kind of tell. That's not. That's kind of maybe just bad investigating or bad evidence analysis. Locations were not well known throughout all of New England. This is going back to Dave's question. I'm going to hit that up in a second, Dave. That's allowable, I think, right? If you're allowing your desire to taint your evidence, maybe not allowable, but it's understandable. And so I'm going to allow that to be kind of there, right? That's evaluating the quality. That's kind of like what Annette was talking about earlier. It's like it's up to the investigator to follow up on things. It's also up to the other investigators to kind of say, dude, you got some faulty reasoning with what you're talking about, or I'm not really sure how you did this. And I don't think you necessarily have to be polite as other people do when you do that, by the way. That's a completely different topic, right? Paranormal evidence, and quite frankly, one I'm not overly concerned with, because that seems like it's pretty clear cut to me. You fake evidence, you're a loser, right? You should not be taken seriously, right? We're talking about the backstories. I'm going to address Dave's question that he picked some obscure spots, because I think that's the important part of it to some degree. There are very weird things happening in Ormond Beach. Once again, you can listen to our Ormond Beach episode 36, I know, just because we were referencing it. They were all, a lot of them were given credit to Tomoki. Tomoki is a made-up character, right? As far as we can determine, Tomoki was created as a mascot, right? Created as a mascot for this state park, and then afterwards they attached all of these weird things that are going on to him. I think, Dave, that maybe there were, to some degree, things that were happening in places. I don't think anyone who knows anything about the paranormal in New England, especially Massachusetts, especially Bridgewater Triangle, can say that there are not strange things happening in Anawan Rock. But I think some of the other ones, other stories that are covered in there, some of them can be backstories or added backstories, those author notes he had in. There's nothing factual in those author's notes. There's nothing presented. There's no, here we go. Here is the record that I'm talking about, right? But I think the fact that they are obscure areas leads it to be able to be more able to lie about it, right? I mean, where is Whitman Farm? That's the question I'm going to ask you. Where is Whitman Farm? It's the best story, arguably the best story in there. Where is Seth? Where is that place in Rhode Island where Seth is in the closet, right? Why are we not giving Seth's full name? Why are we not giving Seth's records? Now, you could pull an Aaron Menke and say that, well, to reveal all of that would interrupt the flow of what I'm talking about. A little shot at Aaron Menke there. But pretty much we can't follow up on most of those stories. Yes, we have a few of them, right? But I mean, I don't think that it's to say the cemetery that's in Boston Gardens or Boston Commons is haunted. What are you gonna do, right? Anawan Rock. Okay, these are places, but most of those stories, if you go and look back, are not specifically named. They're farms. They're grandma's bedroom. Yes, grandma's gripe, right? The intervention. They're not specific places, so you can do what you want. But what happens if it is a specific place? Book 3. Am I holding it the right way? Yes. Dusty Smith. Now, Dusty Smith approached me at a conference that was down here when I first got down here. More than agreeable person. When I mentioned her name, when I do mention her name, people know, right? Like if you were around 10 years ago in the paranormal world, Dusty Smith was someone who was known in Florida, known in the kind of paranormal writer world, since passed. I'm going to tease our next episode, episode 44, a little bit, by saying I'm not going to get into everything that's up with this, specifically, except to say that with a little bit of digging and a little bit of legwork, we were able to find that many of the stories that are in this book are just literally flat out lies. They're flat out lies. They're not presented as folklore. They're presented as, I am telling you the history that happened here so you can understand the hauntings. How can you tell when it's a lie in lore, or when something is more lore than truth? Most of the stories are 7 pages of the backstory and a paragraph of the hauntings that are happening there. Why? And no first-hand sightings. Because you don't have any actual information back it up. There is no haunting. There is no haunting. Or if there is, okay, so I'm gonna I'm gonna give you a little bit of a confession time. We're 46 minutes in, so I can give, or a half hour in, so I can give you confession. Raise your hand if you've read Dark Woods. He waits. Okay, Joan, not Joan. Her name's not Joan. What's her name? I cannot remember her name. Flat out. Joan approached me at a conference in Tingsboro? I can't remember. Stacy, you were there, so I can see that you were there. It was one of the ones, I remember it was May 5th for some reason. And she told me the story that is in Dark Woods. Not word for word. She told me that story. It fit in with other stories that I had heard that were similar to it. When it came time to write Dark Woods, I didn't have her information. I didn't have her last name. Not her name. First name's not Joan. I didn't have where she lived. I couldn't remember. I hadn't got that interview on tape, but I remembered it so clearly. I remembered some of the details. So I presented that story firsthand, like from her recollections, from her story. I crafted what I remembered from what she had said. Am I a liar? Did I tell the truth? Right? Some of those quotes I very clearly remember, right? I remember jotting them down when I went back in. But I can tell you right now, the story's not word for word. And I can tell you that what she told me, the truth of what she told me, are on those pages. The story, the way she told me, is on, but it's not word for word. And I can't contact Joan now to follow up on that, regardless of how many TV shows approach me and ask me. Am I a liar? Okay, and then maybe we can ask that two different parts of that. Am I a liar? Is it unethical what I did? Those are two different things. Right? It's a little bit of a gray area. Because I presented her information, I didn't fake data. If you're asking whether I trusted what she said, right? Because that would be the ultimate thing. I couldn't go and investigate where she had said. I couldn't sit in her bedroom and wait for a puckwudgie to appear in the mirror. Right? So I have to go with, did I think that she was honest? Yeah, I thought she was honest. She presented herself as honest. And on top of that, it was going, other people were saying similar things to it or had heard similar stories about it. And so I felt it was fair to include her story in there, even though I didn't have that first-person interview. This is a little different. Now I'm deflecting off of me. Although I'd love to hear people's opinion. I got some people in here. I'd love to hear how many of you people think, because I can take it. The book's 10 years old. Okay. Natalie makes an excellent point, which is, according to Malcolm Gladwell, I am a liar. Our memories are never accurate. Thank you very much. And it was probably about that amount of time that he had tested those people about it when I finally checked it. So Natalie is calling me a liar. Thank you, Natalie. That's awesome. Dave is saying, I interviewed a guy, got it all recorded. There was no way I could write that what he told me as valid as he gave it. In a way, it would even come across as English. LOL. I'm with you. And you know what? Like, I've got several books on taking oral history. And basically what Dave is saying is that the way that he communicated it would be impossible to write it, right? So you have to kind of form it. But there are two different things. There's the folklorist aspect of things and the archiving of information, and then there's the representing. So this is kind of like oral history 101. When you are recording for archive purposes, you do not edit at all, right? However, when you, and I'm doing this right now because I'm going through all these transcripts of interviews that we did, when you are retelling what they say, right? As in, like, you're quoting them. Not in a newspaper, but in like a book form. You leave out the A. You leave out A, O, E. You leave out those. You leave out the ands, because most people when they talk, they say, so we went down the street and it was really dark and then this thing jumped out. You put punctuation in there, right? It's just kind of something you do. Eddie says, if you are writing what you remember, you may be wrong, but that doesn't make you a liar. Yeah, I mean, I think if I then went on to present, which I never do, I always deflect Joan. I think if I went on and then said, Joan told me her story is exactly as she said it, I would be considered a liar. But kind of putting the story out there and framing it, I feel maybe less. I'm moving on to Dusty Smith. She spends a lot of time in this book retelling stories. And oftentimes those stories are written in great detail. Great detail. What people were wearing when something happened. Direct things that they said, right? So she's telling a story, and it's two people talking, and she gives you quotes around what they said. There is so much information about here that's not accurate. Episode 44 will really get into the specifics of this. But there are so much information in here that's flat out wrong, right? I'll give you one example that dropped both Natalie and I. Natalie might be mad at me for sharing this so early, but we're going to say, because she presents a picture of someone, and she says, the character in the picture is the second one from the left, which essentially is a person who is fired for having an affair with his student. And we were at the archives in Stetson. The woman, the archivist, immediately pulled out the picture, identified it, because her version is labeled, and said, not only is that guy was not fired, he was a respected staff member, a faculty member, and he actually served as president. He was interim president between like the two most well-known presidents that schools had. This guy acted as president. It's like, there's no way that he did that, right? And so we spent a lot of time researching and trying to come up with, well, maybe there was an affair, and the person who told her the story got it wrong. As a folklorist, that's really interesting to do. Like, how did the truth get mixed up? We like that. But we were trying to justify someone who probably just lied, right? Probably just lied. Here's a ghost story. Here's a location. Now, the crazy part is, that story in particular doesn't need a lie, right? It doesn't need to have this entirely different story made up about it, because it is a haunted location, and it has a very interesting backstory that already exists, that can be followed up on, that can be verified, that the people that are being talked about were there, that it means something to them. And then you add to that, people have actually had experiences there. Why do you need to make up another story? Is it so that you have the one up on someone, right? And I think that's probably where a lot of this comes from. I'm seeing this in a lot of books. Tampa Triangle is another one. I feel like I just saw something run behind me. Probably Ella. I think there was a time early on when paranormal books were beginning to sell. Annette, you nailed it. And Annette ran, I don't know if you saw the show, for years, her podcast switched over to interviewing people who were writing paranormal books. I think there was a pressure to fill those pages. I think there was a desire to invent a story that, to say, for example, there's this place down the street from me. Everyone thinks it's haunted. People hear screams from it. Now you have to go and create something of why. And I think there was a lot of people, a lot of writers who had 3/4 of a book and wanted to fill the rest. But I also think it was an attitude. I think it was a mindset. The mindset that people weren't going to follow up on this, right? That people weren't going to, oh my word, they started trying, that's horrible, Annette. I used to love your show. People were, it was all in good fun, right? It was all part of the mystique. There was no difference between, and in episode 43 we talk about Edward Lodi. There was no difference between the fun, scary, creepy, maybe not true part, and the desire for there to be truth. And I think I'm going to read Colleen's response, because it kind of leads to the next thing I was going to say. It says, I think a lot of people do that sort of thing to gain fame and for money. They have a different story than the one that's generally told. Folks are going to want to read about it. Yes. Yeah. And I think there was that idea that it was kind of like punching someone in the dark. There's no victim. That's a Simpsons quote. That's not a belief of mine. who's getting hurt by this, right? Who is really going to be affected by this? All it's going to do is creep someone out. This isn't real reporting anyway. This isn't really impactful. All it is a ghost story. To Dave, I think that's why my book never sold. Damn interesting real history, not nearly scary enough to get them to rubber stamp it. It's great. Not only that, but that feeds into, if you remember that book I was reading, Contemporary Hauntings and Contemporary Folklore. She talked about, and I think this is interesting and true. Most hauntings don't have a narrative. They're a series of events, and they're not that interesting, right? They're interesting because they're not supposed to happen. They're horrifying and life-changing, maybe, in either a good way or a bad way, to the people who are experiencing them, but they are not, hey Christina, they are not good storytelling, right? You have to find the narrative of it. The ones that stand out, and they're the exception to the rule, and they're kind of the ones that tower over everything else, as like you're not interesting enough to be written about. What do we do then? Because the story is interesting to us. It's scary enough. As writers, we muddy that line, right? Because we're trying to find truth, or we're trying to explain why the haunting might happen. Jeff Blanchard says all the time, a place is always haunted by the most famous person to have spent any time there. We search for that interesting backstory to sell the small events that happened in the haunted location. And that's where things get tricky. That's where you start to allow possible explanations to become solid explanations, to become truth. And then the next generation doesn't care, because they're reading you as if you are true. That's when the I heard something thing, I heard this story, and it kind of makes sense here. So I'm going to just add them to it. Because, I mean, after all, I'm not lying about there's a haunting there. And I think that's how these things happen. Do we need checkers for that, right? Do you need someone like me? Now, I want to say that I only judge these writers, and I don't judge Charles Robinson at all, because I can't back that up, and I've had a conversation with him about it. Do we judge these writers, or do we say, this is all par for the course, this is all in the name of love? Guess what? If you fell for it, if you didn't back it up, and you love the story, who gives a crap? Who gives a crap whether it was true or not true? Who gives a crap whether they maybe took the element of one thing and added it to another, or they got their evidence confused, or they didn't do their due diligence of looking things up, or do we judge them, and what is kind of the nature of that? Like, are these now ghost stories, or are they fiction? Should we go into our local bookstore, find that book, pull it out, put it in the nonfiction, or put in the fiction section? And I think probably, and here's where the divide between us goes. I don't care that these are lies. As a matter of fact, I think in the last 6 months, this year, in 2018, has been about finding really cool stories, going to the location, finding out they're not true, and still loving the fact that we were in the location, right? We have been to at least 5 places this year that are not the way that they present themselves on the internet, in books, things like that. And as folklorists, we are there. However, in the retelling of those stories, I'm making it very clear that this is folklore. I'm making it very clear that this is what people are saying. People say this story. And here's what we kind of found out about it. Some things we say we can't back up. some things we say we can't, right? We can't prove whether or not the guy worked at that store because we couldn't find any records of the flirting fisherman, right? So can't say whether that story is true or not. We didn't experience anything, but that doesn't mean something. We were trying to justify so much of what Dusty Smith wrote in that book, being like, and again, we'll get into more of the details in the episode, but like, well, maybe there was a cover-up because of the religious aspect of it, and we were doing the work. Like, we were doing the justification of something which probably is not worthy of our justification. Do you care? Okay? So, I would love to get people's responses. All these are made-up stories. Do you care as an investigator? So I've got some investigators in here. That backstory is a lie. Because then you go into that haunting, you go into that location thinking you should be looking for certain kinds of evidence based on the story. As a folklorist, if there's any folklorists out there, do you care? And then as a consumer, as people who are buying these books, people who are falling down those rabbit holes like I do, following up on this information, then you get to the end and you realize that, you were lied to. As a person who watches the TV shows, to find out that the backstory, not evidence not being faked, but that these backstories are not true, do you feel that you've been lied to? Like, is it a bad thing if you find out that this stuff has been false? Maybe not maybe not is a lie or is it not a lie, but how do you feel at those levels of things? Investigators chime in. People who are into folklore, the story aspect of things, can feel free to chime in. And then lastly, as a consumer of these things, as a person who watches the TV shows, reads the books, goes to the locations, if you're a legend tripper, I guess that's more maybe like the folklorist, somewhere in those three. How does that taint you as one of those three kind of consumers, one of those three kind of absorbers of this information? And then lastly, what does it do for the reputation of it, right? So if Dusty Smith is not telling the truth, does that then make all ghost people less likely to be believed, and therefore does that impact you and me? So if you don't want me to read your comments, just don't read. Schlesinger has a series of books of rewritten ghost stories, all written in her own way, absolutely draws you in and romanticizes the locations more. And I would say Edward Lodi's a lot like that too. You go into an Edward Lodi book knowing not all of this is true, and I've put stuff around it, but I'm not going to tell you what's real and what's not, but just kind of enjoy it on that level. But once again, is it presented, Dave, as these are books that are not necessarily true? Christina says, it starts with, so the story goes. I'm fine. If it starts with, the story goes. I agree. That's, Christina, that's exactly how I deal with things. People say, or the story goes, or for years people have told the story of, things like that, I'm perfectly fine with as well. And that's how I get out of being able to be a big old fat liar. Annette, I don't really care when I read it in a book. However, if I'm going to investigate the location, then I want it as close to the facts as possible. Okay, so reading it in a book is fine, but going out is not. And I think to some degree, like, that kind of attitude is what allows people to be like, because they're like, well, it's in a book. It's not like I'm changing things. It's not like I'm affecting things, or people are going out or following up on it. And so, as a writer, it makes me like, what's my accountability to people? And Colleen writes, as an investigator, it makes me nuts. and I don't think it helps the reputation of investigators when going to those places and actually finding evidence when the facts are that the backstory are lies. Let me read that last part again. And I don't think it helps the reputation of investigators when going to those places and actually find the evidence when the facts that the backstory are lies. I think what you're saying is it doesn't help when I'm able to go into, or someone else is able to go into a place that is haunted and prove the backstory wrong. It kind of makes everybody look like a fool, right? It makes the people who were telling this, who told the story, but then it makes us kind of look like, well, why didn't we believe the story, or we're tainted by that? I used to preface one portion of my tour at the Borden house with, rumor has it, blah, blah, blah. And that's her saying blah, 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 not me saying blah, blah, blah about what she wrote. And I felt okay doing that. Right, and I think when I've been on the Lizzie Borden tour and when I've spoken to people, there's such a mixing there of lore and truth that people kind of want that blurredness. So it's almost as if your audience itself is just like I said with the Lodi stuff, is set up to give, as long as the story seems plausible, I'll believe that it's true. Because they're in the mystique of it. They're caught up in it. It's a place where those kind of things live side by side with each other. And yet, is there a responsibility to you as the storyteller of it to point that out to them? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's something we should do. Here's a very interesting thing. If there is, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, if there is a person who is writing about coins, and they write the definitive collection of coins, and then there is a person who is a collector of coins. Follow me for this for a second. There's a person who's a collector of coins, and that person, they find out is a fraud, that they made the coins in their backyard. People don't look at the person who wrote the book about coins any differently. There's a compartmentalization there that happens. I write books about ghosts. I have a podcast about ghosts. When someone does something bad in the field, a paranormal investigator, for example, getting caught naked, that reflects negatively on me. People make that association. They associate those things, right? When I used to love reading Skeptic Inquirer, because so much of their arguments were, here's a topic that's questionable. Here's a person and they're a liar. Therefore, the idea, the concept is not true because we found out that this person's a fraud. That means that all telekinetics are frauds. Like, they kind of have that rationalization. That's the way it happens. If I write a book, I know Champ agrees with me. If I write a book and that book has lies in it, it impacts all the way down. It impacts all the people associated with the paranormal because in the average person's mind, I think all this stuff is connected. And so there is a responsibility. I think there's a responsibility to call out liars or to call out untruths as that, because this is someone who, I'll give you another story to follow this up, and I think we talked about this in Haunted Schools. When I gave the interview of the article on Stonehill College, Stonehill College said they did not want any paranormal investigators there. They didn't want to talk to anyone who was writing books about ghosts. They didn't want to, because I had pissed them off, and so therefore all ghost people were no longer allowed at Stonehill. I went in and I smoothed it over. It's okay now. So there's an association that's made. Not sure if it's right. Definitely not right. I'm not sure if it's okay or not okay for us to exaggerate our stories, for us to present that. I'll leave that to you guys. But the fact that that's being done definitely has an impact all the way down the road, from the local investigating groups to the websites that are trying to get information. And the weird thing is that in most people's minds that are not in this field, the ideas are so connected that when a ghost person lies, it means that a person who writes books on Bigfoot is also a fraud. These things are so related in the average consumer's mind more than it is to us, that there really is, we were going to, I was going to Mayaka State Park a few weeks ago, and I was talking to the ranger there, and he didn't want to talk about any ghost stuff because there had been a fake Bigfoot sighting another place. And so he's like, so I don't believe any of that stuff. There it is. There's your answer right there. So I'd be interested to hear you guys talk about this. I'm going to cut the video off, but we're going to keep the chat up. I'm going to cut the video off, and so we can kind of still talk about this in written form. But we're out about the 1 hour mark, so I want to make it more consumable for people. So I'm going to say goodnight for now on this. If you know of these kind of stories, or if you have an opinion, please write to us. You can post it here on facebook.com/trippingonlegends, or you can email us at spookytripping@gmail.com. If you're not doing it yet, you can follow us. Natalie's at Nene, my friend, on Twitter, and I am at Spooky Balzano. And Spooky Tripping is actually also my Instagram, too. So you can also feel free to hit us up on that. And if you are listening to the show, I have a request. As the summer's coming to an end and as we've got kind of things going on, for those of you guys up in the north, my summer is pretty much over in a week. I go back to school. Go to iTunes, go to wherever you're getting your you get your podcasts. If you haven't listened to a show, listen to a show. Like, why haven't you listened to a show yet? If you have and you like it, go to iTunes and review it for us. Okay? We'd love to get those ratings because, believe it or not, in iTunes and stuff like, you don't go anywhere if people aren't talking about you, right? It's really hard for them to find you, for people outside of who already know you to find you. So please go in and give us if you didn't like us, go away. Like, why are you even listening to this right now if you didn't like us? If you do like us, leave a positive review. So, hopefully, Monday or Tuesday we'll be getting episode 44 where we talk specifically about this stuff out. Until then, have an amazing weekend. I am Christopher Balzano, speaking for Natalie Christ as well, saying here's hoping that all your trips are legendary. Have a great weekend.